Happy Sabbath and welcome to everybody. We've just opened with prayer. For those of you who are new to our study, we are doing our afternoon program on the subject of relationships. This will be our fourth study together on the subject. I believe all of them have been recorded, but one of them was just an audio. But they've not all been uploaded yet. So that's just a bit of background on where we are at this moment in time. Last week, I think people had asked questions on our Zoom chat box here, but I wasn't able to get a copy of those questions if there were any. So I don't know if those questions were captured. If you do have questions, perhaps you could
tell them to send it to LJ. I've just put a message in the forum, in the chat.
We're going to give you the name of what is it, an email or?
That LJ is on there, and I'm going to put my WhatsApp number in there as well.
Okay, so we're going to put a WhatsApp number in here so that people can message Brother Leon directly. Because if you send your questions here on the Zoom chat, I'll probably miss them. Please only take one Zoom position. Okay. Sorry? I don't know. What number?
I've just put my number in there now.
Yeah. Oh, you've done it. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The number's there. It's Leon James, and you have the number there. So if you can just WhatsApp Brother Leon if you have questions, so that's the easiest way for me to receive them. The code is +44. So if you take the 0 off and put +44. That was from Sister Charity. Okay. As I say, we've been talking about a number of questions on relationships, and what I want to do is just basically go into our next question that we have. On my list of questions, they're all sort of a bit scattered, a bit out of order, but this is number 4 of a series of questions that someone asked. How should married couples go about decision making? In previous times, the man would have the final say, which even before this new understanding, I think was inappropriate and a misuse of head of the home. But in general, how should couples go about decision making that impact the family? So this is an important and interesting question. It deals with people's past understanding of headship. It deals with Ellen White's perspective of what headship looks like, and what our current perspective on the subject is about how marriage operates and how decision making should function. If we go back to creation, when God created Adam and Eve, we are informed quite emphatically that Adam and Eve were equal. We're not given specific details, or at least explicit details, about how their decision-making process would work. But based upon the principle and the idea of equality and the work that they were required to do, it seems clear that decisions that they would be made, if I'm going to use the word partnership. And in that model, they would make decisions together. After sin, I think fundamentally that decision-making process doesn't change substantially. They're still supposed to operate or run their relationship in the form of a partnership, or we might call it a business, where they would make joint decisions. I think that relationship has never changed from pre-sin to post-sin. However, Ellen White does speak explicitly about the issue of headship and some of the implications and ramifications of what that would mean in some areas of decision making. So one of the points that she'll talk about over and over again is the role of the husband, or she would call they're trying to change the camera, is it?
It's okay.
You want to move?
No, it's alright. So continue talking. It's funny.
I think we've got a problem with our lighting.
It's okay now.
Okay, so is it all good?
Two things, yeah. It's all good now.
Okay, so it's not good?
It's not very professional. You put a water on my hands.
It's good now. Sorry.
I've lost my thought. So the question is about
decision making. You run.
It's about headship and the decision making process. Post thing, Ellen White speaks about the husband being the house band. She also uses the idea that the husband is the priest that's supposed to bind the family together. She speaks about the sterner qualities of the man. So Ellen White, really in quite explicit terms, does talk about headship. She does talk about the difference between men and women and the roles that they have. And she also says that in difficult situations where husband and wife cannot come to an agreement, then the final decision should lay with the husband. So the question says, how should we have decision making process now? I'm saying substantially it shouldn't be different, because even in past ages, it really should have been a partnership, a business decision making that people would make together, husband and wife. The question that then goes on to say, previous times the man would have the final say. And the questioner says that they think that was inappropriate and a misuse of the head of the home. I don't know whose question that is, but my understanding is the way Ellen White counsels us on this issue, that pretty much that's how she would describe it, that the husband would have basically the final say in what decisions were going to be made. However ugly or bad that we might think that to be. I'm just trying to find a Bible verse if I can. So the idea of headship, I think, is fairly well established. The question is, what do we do about headship today? How does it operate? How do relationships operate? I want to refer us back to a series of presentations that were done in Uganda earlier this year. I think most of them were done in late January into early February. And the reason why I want us to go there is because in those presentations we did a study on Deuteronomy chapter 22 verse 5, which most of us are all familiar with, but I will read it to us. Deuteronomy 22 verse 5. The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are abomination unto the Lord thy God. I think most of us are familiar with that passage, and I just want to make comment on that so that we're all familiar with where that study would take us. So, as I say, we spent a lot of time in Uganda earlier this year dealing with this subject about Deuteronomy 22:5 and how we should address it both in its historical context and its prophetic context. Ellen White, when she addresses this passage, takes the wording of Deuteronomy 22:5 in its most literal sense, and she argues that women are not allowed to wear men's clothes, and that's what the focus of her attention is on. But when we discuss the subject of Deuteronomy 22:5 in its original setting, the conclusion was that even though it speaks about literal clothing, the context was on the role in society between men and women. That men would have a particular role in society and women would have their role. And if you were to turn back 2 chapters in the book of Deuteronomy, this would be Deuteronomy chapter 20. Deuteronomy chapter 20 is a good introduction into Deuteronomy 22, the chapter itself. Chapter 20 is about warfare, and it discusses what's going to happen and how war would be prosecuted once Israel was established in the land of Israel, in the Promised Land. And God discusses the role that men should play and how they should conduct themselves under a whole heap of different circumstances. The reason why that becomes significant is when you go into Deuteronomy 22:5 and you actually go into the original Hebrew and start looking at what's being discussed, it really is speaking about the societal role of men as warriors and the role of women as those who stand back in times of conflict and don't engage with war. And that's the context of that that passage, the chapters 20, 21 into 22, is that men go out to do war and women stay back home and don't go out to war. And that's what that issue about the clothing is really dealing with. It's not dealing with that men wear trousers and women don't, because the actual clothing that they wore are very similar. It really talks about the role that men and women are to play. And we could say that in the context of headship. Now, when we come to our own dispensation, only a few short years ago, there were people, even within our movement, who would argue about whether or not sisters, about women, could actually be part of the 144,000. And the reason they would argue that is twofold. One, on the actual nature and the role of the 144,000, who they were, but also that the 144,000 were priests. And the argument was that only men could be priests, which is the same argument that the church uses, our conservative Adventist church, that uses to say that women cannot be ordained as pastors. It's the same logic, the same argument, and it's based upon the priesthood of Aaron, which you can see in Hebrews chapter 7, where Paul compares between the ministry of Melchizedek and the ministry of Aaron. So, just want to summarize. If you go back to Deuteronomy, Moses is going to discuss the subject of dress in the context of the role that men and women play in society. They have a different role. Ellen White's going to reinforce that that model based upon headship. It's going to move away from warfare to headship. And conservative Adventism has perpetuated that model in its understanding of the role and leadership within God's church, spiritual leadership, that pastors, ministers, elders can only be men, not women. And that filtered into the thinking of a number of people in our movement, both men and women in our movement, held on to that sexist position that if that was so, that everything in the Bible is directed toward men being heads, then women couldn't really be priests, in this movement even, to the fact that that only men could be part of the 144,000. Now, that argument, I'm hoping each of us recognises to be not only weak, but faulty at its very base, that we expect everybody in this movement to be teachers, and the definition of a teacher is the definition of someone who is wise, and the subject of the priest, or the symbol of being a priest, is the symbol of those who teach. And we have clear, inspired evidence that women should be teachers in God's church at the end of the world. Ellen White is clear on that subject. So when we consider that priests are essentially teachers, are essentially the wise, this is the argument that we've used to show that both men and women are priests. And that argument was made and won long before the subject of equality came into the movement. All we had not done was taken that model of equality, of priests, men and women being equal, and brought that into the home life. So, just want to summarise. We know that in the Old Testament, warfare was prosecuted on obviously a literal level. You went out to make literal war. Elder Tess has spoken of this time and time again. In fact, in her presentation just today, she introduces her study with the idea that in the Stone Age, people fought or made war with stone, and in the Information Age, you make war with information. So, we know that in the time period in which we're living, we too have to make war against God's enemies. And the way we make war is through the gospel. Paul addresses this issue very clearly when he equates being a Christian to being a soldier. So we know that both men and women in the movement are supposed to teach, are supposed to share the gospel equally. That is nothing new. That was done 2,000 years ago. So therefore, both men and women are, in the context of war, warriors. And therefore, our understanding of Deuteronomy 22 verse 5 is not that we change our understanding, it's that we recognise that that verse has to be understood dispensationally, and that verse is no longer applicable to God's people. Is it still profitable and useful? Yes, so we can understand where we are today, but it's not a verse that should be followed. That's the argument that we have made over many classes earlier this year to show why Deuteronomy 22:5 is no longer applicable. And then we took that idea because Ellen White took that passage and applied it to the issue of wearing trousers, or women wearing trousers or pants, depending on which country you come from, what you call them. And that's why this movement has taken the position that women wearing pants or trousers becomes a symbol of headship, a symbol of inequality. And therefore that's why there was an insistence over the past 12 months or so that sisters should be wearing trousers and pants to make a statement that we believe in equality and that we do not believe in headship. We also want to remind us, if you go to 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 6, 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 6, this is the same history in the Old Testament that deals with Sarah and Abraham. And Peter says this: I'm going to go back to verse 5. For after this manner in the old time the holy women also who trusted in God adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, lowercase l, whose daughters ye are, as long as ye do well, and are not afraid with any amazement. Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honour unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. And these three verses, verses 5 to 7 that I've just read, 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 to 7, is pretty much bread and butter for conservative Adventists. The argument goes that husbands are supposed to treat their wives decently and respectfully, etc., etc. But it clearly says in verse 5 that wives are meant to be in subjection to their husbands, and so much so that Sarah, understanding this, her role or her relationship with her husband, would call him Lord. I'm sure that each of us today, particularly over the last 12 months, would find such verses, if not abhorrent, at least very strange. We know that we cannot follow these practices. So I just want to go back to the question. The questioner asked how a relationship is supposed to operate today, and the questioner said that they thought it was inappropriate for men to be the head of the home. And I guess where I probably would disagree with the person is that you can use these Bible passages and Ellen White quotes to demonstrate that what might appear to be extremely ugly today was pretty much accepted in the past. And I think inspiration does teach that men were the head of the home. So the question is, how should relationships operate today? And I want to suggest that they should operate in the same way relationships should have operated even in those past ages. That they should have been a process of discussion and negotiation. I would argue that if you're in a relationship back in those days where headship was commonly practiced, was accepted by both husbands and wives, that if you ever got to a place where you could not agree, where there was a disagreement, that if the husband would call up their trump card and say, well, I'm the head of the house and we're going to do it this way, that I would argue that this was a complete failure in the marital relationship. I would argue also that even in the model of headship that God had given, that for a relationship to deteriorate so far where a husband would have to exert that kind of authority over his wife, to me that would be indicative of a relationship, a marriage that had fundamentally broken down and failed. If a couple could not come to a common agreement, a common solution, then I would suggest that their relationship is not functioning properly. And what tended to happen is, in relationships that operated this way, men would think that because wives would submit to their husbands, that because there was peace in the marriage, because there was no argument, that this was indicative of the Holy Spirit leading in their relationship. And I would argue that in most cases, what it was truly indicative of was that there was at least mental and emotional abuse, if not physical. The questioner asks, how should decision making work now? And I would suggest that it should be done on a voting, in a voting model or a democratic model. Now, I'm not saying that we should take this literally, but I'm just seeing this as a parable so that hopefully you get my point. I don't know how many people in our chat group today are on a board, or they work for a company that's on a board, and if you have either been on a board in your previous life in the church or in a business, or you currently are, you'll know one thing. When you set up a board, what is the ideal number of participants that you would have in that board? Maybe someone can turn off their audio and shout an answer out. I know people are on boards here in our group, so someone must have an answer, or they don't know how boards work very well. No one willing? I know Elder Magic's here, he's gung-ho about boards, he's not even answering. Okay, so it's down to me.
Good.
The answer is an odd number. Why do we have odd numbers on boards?
Oh, they're all muted, Magic says.
I know, but they can unmute, or they've been forced to mute.
No, they can't. They can't.
Okay, so apparently no one can unmute themselves. We've got.
Unmute them.
But somebody's put 5 and 13. Someone's put 5.
Okay, so people. Oh, so people are starting to answer. So I'm saying it's odd. You have to have an odd number, because if you have an even number, what would happen? You'd end up getting a stalemate. You could potentially have 5 and 5, and you'd get to a place where you couldn't make decisions, because you get to the place where if 5 vote for yes and 5 vote for no, you have a stalemate. And yes, Brother Bob and Sister Penny says you have a 50-50 split, and to avoid that you have +1, so you always go for an odd number. So I'm saying in a marriage relationship, the way you should operate would be using this democratic process, that everybody involved on this board, which is your marriage business, should have a vote, an equal vote. Yeah, so someone says that the chairperson would have the casting vote, which is why you would have an odd number, so that you could end up always having a decision that's made. So I'm saying that marriages should operate in the same way a board does, that each person in that marriage should have an equal vote. And what would happen if marriages ran that way? So you disagree on something, the husband says one thing and the wife says another, and then they vote. And what would happen? So Sister Emma said you'd get a stalemate, which is what Brother Bob and Sister Penny would say. You'd avoid a 50-50 split. So in marriages, what you would end up doing is having a 50-50 split, and you could not make a decision. I'm suggesting this is the way marriage should work. That if you both have an equal casting vote, if you cannot come to an agreement, then whatever decision that was, you don't decide on that subject. So whether it's the most trivial issue or the most complex issue, if you cannot come to an agreement on the subject, you just make a principled decision that you will either ignore it or move on or leave it, or keep on wrestling through this issue until you're both persuaded to see this issue the same way, and then when you voted, you'd both get 100% on side A or side B. I'm suggesting this is the only sure and safe way to peace and happiness in a marriage, is if you both have an equal vote. And I, as I say, I use that in a parabolic sense, I'm not saying you obviously literally going to put your hands up and vote, but hopefully everybody gets the point that if you cannot come to an agreement, husbands and wives, if you cannot persuade one another using all the principles of equality, and when I mean equality, what I want us to understand is when I say equality in this particular context, I mean this. Equality equals respect. If you cannot treat each other in this discussion with respect, then the business meeting ends. If you cannot come to an agreement that you're both voting the same way, the business meeting comes to an end. And what you need to do is make a principled decision, however complex, however life-threatening, however simple any decision is, that you always follow this principle. If you don't agree, you don't move forward with that decision. And all the discussion has to follow this principle of both of you being respectful to one another or having equality. And I think if couples can actually begin to learn to operate in that fashion and be principled about that, you get to a place where you begin to actually listen to one another. And most couples think that they do listen to one another, but in my experience, most couples don't. You can be talking, you can have your spouse talk to you and you can be silent and you can give the appearance that you're hearing them, but doesn't mean you're listening. Sorry?
Yeah, definitely not.
Yes, Sister Emma says definitely not. So there's it's not someone's talking and someone's being quiet. That is actually not listening. What I'm talking about, really, most people have lost the ability, or they never learn to actually listen to what someone's saying. And if we took away the model of traditional headship, that some person has a veto, which is essentially what headship really is, on any and every subject, and we followed these principles of equality, which means treating people with respect, which means having a business, a marriage that has an even number, 2, and each one has an equal vote, you would find that very soon you would actually really have to listen. And once you began to practice the art of listening, I think many of the problems that we find that are intractable actually would, I'm going to say in perhaps poetic language, would melt away. Now you might think that you've tried this before. You might say, well, if you knew my spouse, if you knew my husband or my wife, that those problems wouldn't just melt away. And I want to say, I'm using that phrase melt away in a poetic way. I know it's a struggle, I know it's difficult, but these things are achievable. I say that because we know it's God's will that we have equality. We can show that prophetically. And if this issue is on the line, we know that God's promises, His requirements, are His enablings, as a rough paraphrase of what Ellen White would teach us. God requires this of us, and therefore we know it's His will, and therefore we can, with practice and with determination, actually achieve this end goal. But for too many of us, we're not prepared to put forth the struggle or the effort. Last week, I think it was last week, we spoke at some length discussing that in our relationships, in marriage, that we find ourselves in a situation where people are complaining, especially men, husbands. And the complaint is that we used to be happy in our marriage, even my wife was happy, but now this introduction of this equality message has introduced strife and warfare into what used to be a civilized, polite, safe marriage. And I want to push back against that with the following argument. If you go to the 19th century and you go to the United States, and depending on where you want to begin, but we could just begin from 1798 all the way to 1861, in that history you had relative peace on a plantation in the southern states, and that's because those slaves didn't have any freedoms. They never had a voice. They just had to do what they were told to do. And that model of slavery really is the model of many conservative marriages, and particularly or including marriages in this movement. And those couples who think that they used to be happy, the reason why there was peace in many of those situations was because women didn't have a right to speak or to speak what was on their minds. And that gave the appearance of peace, but it was not really peace. I'm going to argue that it was slavery. And now that women are beginning to find their voices, wives in these marriages, and they're beginning to question much of what has taken place, it does and it will of necessity, I think, initially cause strife when the authority of men is being questioned. I want to make one point. I've come across this on a number of occasions, and therefore I suspect it happens quite frequently. When a question comes up in a marriage and women are expecting that their voices are heard, when women are expecting that the way decisions are made needs to be changed, and they voice concerns and unhappiness, some of them addressing issues that have been there for years, perhaps decades. Husbands could potentially and have argued, well, if it was so bad, why did you never complain before? And this shows to me the level of ignorance and sexism that has been prevalent in our movement, in the marriages that we have. And what I've noticed happens after a while of this argument or this strife, husbands begin to take this idea that the women, their wives, are nagging, and they say, you know what, if you think you can do a better job, you take charge, you take control of this issue, like the marriage, or you make all the decisions that I used to make. And in parenthesis, or sometimes they say it, then you'll realize how difficult this is, that I used to make all these decisions, now you make those decisions. Now, I'm not sure what the motivation besides frustration is on the part of men when they do that, but one of them I know for sure is that what they're expecting to see, and I hope, but I fear that many of them are waiting and hoping to see, is their wives fail. They know full well that these wives have no experience perhaps in running their bank accounts or running some other part of the family business, because they have no experience, and this could have been going on for 20 years. And the men have been doing this for decades perhaps, and they know all the ins and outs of how to operate. And just to throw all of this responsibility upon their wives and say, well, you take the lead now, and then you know how difficult this is. All this is just another form of abuse. And if there are husbands listening to this presentation, I want to both warn you and admonish you never to do such a thing. Never to throw back this issue of strife onto your spouse and say to her, oh, the reason is because you think this is easy, you try doing this. This is not equality. It's not equality to show a wife how incompetent she is of running the family business that she has no experience of running. That would be like the husband, if he worked for a company and he was complaining that the company didn't run well and he didn't like the management, it would be like the management saying, well, okay, you run the business. And he couldn't do it. It's one thing to complain, it's one thing to say that things are not done properly, and it's another thing to have the ability to run a business. So coming back to this point, the reason why there's so much strife in marriages in the movement today, and from my experience, it's more prevalent than many people are willing to admit. And the reason for that is that men, husbands, are unwilling to follow this model of having an even number on a board, having equality or respect, and actually going down this path and struggling with it. Sisters are equally struggling with this. They don't have the experience of actually knowing how to make decisions, of being able to have equality and having their voices heard. So it really is a difficult situation. But I want to admonish everybody who's listening, whether this is in your marriage or whether it's in a ministry, that when sisters are put into positions of responsibility, or wives are of necessity being admonished to take up their role as equal partners in this business, that they need the support and help of their husbands. And that help or support can come in many different guises. Sometimes it might mean just getting out of the way. Sometimes it might mean some training on how things are actually run. But the most important is that men, and we're talking about relationships, marriage relationships here, men actually listen to their wives and allow them to have their voice to be heard. And not only to be heard, but really to be listened to. So, I was going to say that's a brief response to to the question of how should married couples go about the decision-making process today. So I'm hoping these are a few guidelines to help you along that road. So I just want to really reiterate, if you're struggling in your relationship and you're a husband and you're frustrated, which you may well be, do not throw up your arms and say, I've had enough, you take over if you think you can manage the situation better than I can. Your wife does not want that, she's not asking for that. What she's asking for is for the family to be running a different line, not for someone to be the boss, but for the family business to be run on a partnership.
Someone's raised their hand about Deuteronomy 22, something what you mentioned briefly.
Okay, so someone's asked about Deuteronomy 22 verse 5, and it says, cannot be applied in any way at all. For example, making spiritual application where men is the state and women is the church, and none can participate or take part on each other's jobs or functions. So if you want to take the role of men and women and try to make that church and state, what I want us to remember is that Deuteronomy 22 verse 5 is based upon a relationship between husbands and wives, about the roles of men and women in society. And if we're going to transpose that and try to make some application of church-state relationship, I want to remind us of last week's presentations, and Elder Tess brought it to view again in this week's presentation, of Revelation chapter 13, the lamb-like beast that has two horns. And we know what makes the United States the glorious land, that made it so great, so prominent, that in fact made it lamb-like, is that these two horns were separated, that church and state do not have a relationship. So I would argue that Deuteronomy 22 verse 5 is not even applicable in a church-state fashion, because Deuteronomy 22 verse 5 says, in a relationship, between husband and wife, they have different roles, and therefore in a society, church and state have these different roles, but they come together and they work together, just like in Deuteronomy 22, where these wives and husbands are working together. If you go back and look at Deuteronomy 20, it speaks about the context of going to make war, and it's all to do with family relationships and how they're supposed to work and how society functions. But the church and state are supposed to be completely and totally separate and isolated from one another. And therefore I would argue that Deuteronomy 22 verse 5 should not even be brought under the auspices of church-state, because church and state are not supposed to have any kind of relationship one with another. The United States may have been formed by Christians or whatever kind they were, but the country itself should have been a secular country. It was not a country that was meant to be what they call now a Christian country, or a country that was under God, or a country that trusted in God. That was not what the United States should be. And when it speaks about a lamb-like beast, it's not lamb-like because it's Christ-like, that it's a Christian nation. That was never what its intention was. And if you're not clear upon that, you could just turn to A.T. Jones, and he waxes eloquent on this subject, that the United States was meant to be a secular state. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Oh, I think someone has posted up, the Flukas family has posted up the video link for 3 classes on Deuteronomy 22 verse 5. It's parts 1, 2 and 3, January 6th to 26th this year in Uganda. So if you can see that, they've posted the video links for those classes that deal with that subject. Next question. Is it inappropriate to hold hands or to kiss your partner and be physical during courtship? And if so, why? Barring intercourse. So I did tackle this last week as well, but I think it was through a previous question, but I'm going to tackle it again. We do have perhaps different people. What's wrong with kissing or touching? I want to just step back as we consider this issue. Now, when we did studies on the nature of man, for those of you back in 2017, for those of you who have listened to those presentations, you will know that I built the following model of a human being. I said that this was a human being, and that this was the shell, and there was a heart, and you were in the heart, and you were inside this shell. And this shell, there's a nice Spirit of Prophecy quote that says this is the house that you live in. So you live inside the house, just like a literal house, and there you are inside your house. So the house is your body, and that's you. And that's an accurate representation of a human body, or sorry, a human being. However, it's not a complete model of a human being. So this separation between the inner and the outer being, or the spiritual and the physical, is true and accurate. And I think it was last week I gave a model of a sponge. I'd refer you back to, I think it's last week's presentation, maybe the week before, on that modelling, all taken from the studies done back in 2017. Now the reason I want to mention that is when you start considering more about the construction or the nature of a human being, if we were to take this study and throw it away and do another study on a blank sheet of paper, what you can demonstrate quite clearly, relatively easily, is that you are this physical thing here. You're not just a house. Now you could chop your arm off and that piece of flesh that's on the table wouldn't be you, but the rest of your physical being is you. You are physical. And the reason why that becomes significant is in the terms of, as it's used in Genesis chapter 2, if we went to just chapter 1 to 3, a human being is a construction of a spiritual entity and a physical body. They merge or mesh together to become one, or we would call a human being, or the Bible says in the King James, a living soul. And what Christians have done to our detriment, we have done a disservice, is that we have forgotten about our own, I'm going to say our own humanity. And what I mean by that is we have neglected our own physical nature. People do this in very extreme ways. For instance, if you were born into the Catholic Church, you might decide to become a nun or a monk, and you would do that to forego the pleasures of the flesh. If you were one of the devotees of Kellogg, you would take the position that having intimacy, except for the purpose of procreation, having children, was something that was damaging or harmful to your being, that it would sap or take away vital force from you and you would die quicker, essentially. Or just having passionate thoughts about your spouse were in some way evil or wicked or sinful and would contaminate you. So there's been this continual theme that there is something wrong with the physical body. And many women are brought up in a way or treated in a way that their bodies are in some way not clean or are dirty in some way. The Old Testament speaks about this, where it speaks about a woman's menstrual cycle, or if a baby girl is born, how it differently she's treated compared to how a male child is born. So there are all these things about our physical bodies. And the point that I want to speak about here is that what we do is we tend to stifle our own physical nature. And it's completely wrong to do that. We are physical beings, and it's to our own harm and detriment that we deny our own physical being. In fact, Paul talks about that. He says that no man would harm his body. No man would not want to take care of his body. It's inbuilt in us. In fact, your body is designed to self-heal, to repair itself. We all know that. And he uses that argument to make the premise that husbands should take care of their wives. However sexist that model is, he makes a point that I want to make, which is the importance of the physical nature of a human being. And what I want us to see on that is that physical touch, physical chemistry, sex is not only healthy and normal, it is essential for a human being's health. If you're married to someone, and barring some genuine reason why you cannot have intimacy, having intimacy with your spouse is not only right and proper, it's actually healthy for you. It's been demonstrated both at a chemical, at a hormonal and an emotional level that intercourse, touch is important to maintain one's health. when a couple come together and they have a properly functioning relationship, their bodies come into tune with one another, even at a hormonal level. When you have sex, it produces a flood of hormones which are not only pleasurable, but they are productive of health, and they have healing properties within them. Both emotionally, they stop you from becoming depressed, they raise your immune system. On so many levels, intimacy is healthy. The reason why I say all of that is we are driven, and you really have to fight against nature not to meet your physical needs, your physical desires, because we are programmed to have those needs met. That's why people find other people attractive, because it's an inbuilt desire. It's designed within us, this desire of sexual attraction towards somebody. Now, the reason why we recommend that you do not have physical contact with a spouse is, as soon as you begin to relate together on a physical basis, whether you touch or kiss or hug or become more intimate, the more you do that, the more you, if I can say it this way, trick your system and essentially let your guard down. What happens is you begin to connect with this person on multiple levels, not only spiritually, not only emotionally, but physically. And once you start connecting with a person on these multiple levels, it becomes harder to detach from them. So if you become physically intertwined with them, you become physically attached to them, at a later point, if you find that you're not mentally attached with them or not emotionally attached, it becomes more harder, becomes difficult to break your relationship, because you're attached to them at this physical level. It's primarily a recognition of this attachment and the power of physical attraction and physical attachment that we recommend that people do not have physical attachments one with another in a courtship. Kissing is not just two people putting their lips together and, you know, you can describe it in a really gross and horrible fashion, that, you know, someone's rubbing their tongue on your teeth, or, you know, you can make it sound really gross if you wanted to. But those people who have kissed, especially your first kiss, you will know that there is something electrifying and special about that first kiss in particular. But the actual physical act of it, if you were to describe it, it's pretty gross when you think about it. And there is something about this physical connection that really is important. And what I want to suggest, which people may not agree with, is that when two people come together in the ultimate act of intimacy, this is not only a physical connection, there is a spiritual connection between those two people. They actually connect together at, I hope people don't get hung up on these words, on a metaphysical, on a non-physical level, just by having physical intimacy. That's why adultery can be damaging. Now, we're sophisticated beings, and we can have intimacy or sex, intercourse, at different levels. There are different types of sex. Perhaps the two, if I make the two obvious ones, which are really, you know, different contrasts, you have, as Paul would say, the undefiled bed. This is a couple, as in the Song of Solomon, who are so madly in love with one another, when they join physically, they're in heaven. That's one extreme. The other extreme is rape. So both of them are committing the same act, but they're completely different. And in between, there are many forms of intercourse. Sexual intercourse between a couple, even a married couple, can be at different levels. Some people have sex, and the way they have sex is to meet certain needs, which means that that actual sexual act doesn't fulfill the needs of a complete normal human being. And so without going into the details of the different types of sexual activity that a couple can get into, and it's not like once you're married you're only going to do sex one way. I'm not talking about the body positions, I'm talking about the way two people come together and the reasons, the motivations that they come together. It can vary through their experience. It can vary from one intimate act to another, but they do tend to run in cycles. All I'm trying to say is that people have sex to meet different needs. In its purest, most elevated experience, sexual intercourse actually is a spiritual experience that two people go through. And I'm hoping for those people who have actually, you know, when you talk about your first love, or maybe your teenage sweetheart, whenever that was, that first kiss that you gave that person, maybe it's the first kiss you've ever given, or maybe the first kiss that you gave that person, it is, people would call it a heavenly experience. It's more than just the mechanical act of kissing. People kiss their children, people kiss their pets, people kiss their grandparents, people kiss the Pope's hand. There are many ways to kiss, but when you kiss your lover for the first time, it is a spiritual experience. And this is the danger that people face when they enter into physical contact at a premature moment in their relationship. It begins to desensitize their business faculties, their business, the business of deciding whether or not this relationship is good or bad. That's the fundamental reason why it is wrong, or why we suggest that people should not be entering into physical contact. We discussed this last week, and I'm not saying that you should never hold hands over a 24-month or an 18-month period from beginning to end of courtship. What I am saying is people should understand what the principles are, and they should self-manage their own relationships. It's for them to decide if and when they're going to kiss, if and when they will hug, if and when they will hold hands. Then the questioner asked, interestingly, initially they said, obviously we're not talking about intercourse. They said, oh, by the way, just for interest's sake, what's wrong with premarital sex anyway? What's the problem with it? And so the problem is that when you marry someone, you're making this lifelong commitment to say, not only are you going to be with each other mentally, spiritually, but also physically. And as I've already said, that physical act of coming together is more than just two hot, sweaty bodies coming together one night. It's much more than that. For many people in marriage, that's all it ever ends up being, which is a shame. Because if that's what intimacy is for you, I want to tell you that that's not what God's plan for it was. And this goes beyond the subject of orgasms and the sheer pleasure of intercourse, although that does have a factor that does play into this subject. But the act of two bodies coming together in that way, you have to get so close to somebody, you have to trust them so much that if intercourse was done in a way that it was designed to, two people really do become one flesh on a plane or a level that I guess one of the best places you can describe this is in the Song of Solomon. That couple who are so connected together, it becomes a spiritual experience. Of course, you'll know that many romantic novels or many romantic songs, Hollywood, all of those avenues are trying to portray the importance and significance of physical intimacy. So the question is, what's wrong with doing it before you marry? So if we're just going to take the mechanical act, there's no big deal. You know, what is it? What difference does a day make to somebody? You could have intimacy the day before you married, on the day or the day after, or if you're going to do it on the day before, what's wrong with the week before, a year before, first time you meet? So without getting into the technicalities of, or the mechanics of why it was right and wrong, from a moral perspective, what I want to say is that what God wants us to do is recognize the sanctity of two people coming together. I think last week I gave the example of baptism. Now, if you go through the New Testament and Spirit of Prophecy, you know that it's only at baptism that you are considered to actually have entered into the kingdom of heaven. Jesus began his ministry when he's baptized. Baptism is the entrance into one kingdom and the departure from another kingdom. You leave the kingdom of Satan and you enter the kingdom of God. So we know that the ceremony itself is this turning point in a person's life. But you also already know that you cannot be baptized until you've given fruits of repentance. Till you have demonstrated that you are born again already. So you need to be born again first before you actually go to the mechanics of actually going into a pool and getting baptized. The vows talk about this. So you already need to be fully committed in your relationship to Christ before you're baptized. I think most of us understand that. Ellen White says that many Christians, many Adventists, are buried alive. That's the term she uses, and that means they are born in water. They're buried in that ceremony, and when they come out of that water, instead of being born again, they had never died in that water. So when they rise up, it's just the old man of sin that went in the water, was there for a moment, and just carries on life as normal. The old man never died. So therefore, the old man of sin has to be done away with before baptism, not after. If you took that analogy and brought it to marriage, we're really married before you do the ceremony. And yet, the counsel is not to have intercourse before the actual ceremony itself. Psychologists, I know this is it can end up being a sort of a cliche phrase, because many people just like psychologists without giving any particular reference to that, know one thing, and that is that human beings function well with habits or ceremonies, institutions, habits, cultural norms. And this is so important. We know it's important because God designed religion to have all of these ceremonies and all this paraphernalia attached to it to help us to remember the importance and sanctity and sacredness of this spiritual experience that we're supposed to go through. That's why marriage is such a big deal. It's all done in an open, you invite your friends. That's why baptism is public and not private. God sees the necessity of us showing our commitment in a physical way that people can see, that we can demonstrate. And that's why it's far safer to actually wait for the day that you actually go through that ceremony before you actually have intimacy. If you wanted to be technical about it, it really wouldn't make any difference one way or the other. I mean, once you've reached engagement and you've committed to marry one another, you've pretty much done that deal. But even at that moment, legally even in God's eyes, you can withdraw your commitment. God marks the point where you enter into that ceremony and you exchange those vows as the moment of marriage. But technically you're already one before that. But he marks the ceremony. And this becomes an important point when we start dealing with the subject and issue of sin, about the act or just the premeditated thought. But I want to not delve any further into that. What is the principle behind waiting for the marriage ceremony? I've tried to go through that. The principle is these ceremonies are God-given to us. I'm not saying the actual ceremony of marriage itself and the form of that worship, but the actual ceremony, the act, is given to us by God. And I think it's healthy and safe for us to wait until that moment where we actually become one flesh. If people choose to touch hands or to hug or to kiss beforehand, I think it's for them to make those decisions based upon their own cognitive ability, trying to understand why these rules are set in place. I would tell everybody it's dangerous to become physically connected to one another at the beginning of your courtship. I think far too many people do, and you just make a rod for your own back when you do that. You just make it so difficult for yourself to extricate yourself out of a relationship once you've had physical contact, not even just intimacy.
Someone's asked in the thread, isn't sex outside marriage fornication a sin?
So someone's asked, is having intimacy, intercourse outside of marriage fornication? So you can use these technical arguments to make those arguments, and I would not disagree with those technical arguments. What I wanted to do, instead of just using like a proof text to say it says it therefore it is to try to show why it's not so good to do that. Is it fornication to kiss your future partner on the cheek? Kiss their hand goodnight once you've been on a date with them? People would argue yes or no. Is it fornication to hold their hand? At what level would you define where fornication would be fornication, or whether it would just be unwise? Would it be actual intercourse or foreplay? Or where would you place that point of indiscretion? I don't think it's that straightforward once you start delving into these issues. For instance, if you're married, would it be fornication to, if you're a husband, to hug your secretary in an inappropriate way? Sure. But would it be inappropriate to hug your secretary because she's needs some consolation? Probably not. Would it be inappropriate to hug your future spouse, the person that you're courting, at the end of a date that you went on with them? It may be, it may not be. Fornication, I don't think, is that straightforward a subject, except when you come to the subject of sex. You may think that it is, but I wanted to try to approach the subject from a different perspective, instead of just saying, it's fornication, therefore don't do the thing.